When the fleet of Jorvax the Conqueror descended upon Earth, it was as though the heavens themselves were announcing their submission. Jorvax, the infamous warlord of the Velnakians, had built an empire on the ashes of countless civilizations. Encased in quantum armor that shimmered with unbreakable energy, he towered over all who dared face him. For centuries, he had crushed resistance without effort, leaving entire species to speak his name in whispers of fear. Earth, with its unruly patchwork of nations and primitive technology, seemed destined to meet the same fate. From his flagship, the Dominance Eternal, Jorvax studied the blue-green world spinning below him. It looked fragile, like a bauble to be smashed in his hand. In standing at the command deck's observation window, he turned to his officers, his crimson eyes glowing with disdain. "This planet has no defense worth noting," he declared. "Its inhabitants are disorganized, fractured. They will kneel, as all others have." "Shall we proceed with the annihilation protocols, Exalted One?" one of his officers asked, bowing low. Jorvax let out a laugh that reverberated through the deck like thunder. "No! Let us enjoy this conquest. Begin the broadcast." Across Earth, screams of every kind flickered to life. The Velnakian insignia, a black star pierced by jagged red lines, flashed for a moment before Jorvax's visage filled the display. His voice boomed across the planet, interrupting live broadcasts, overriding personal devices, and lighting up digital billboards in crowded cityscapes. "I am Jorvax the Conqueror. Your planet is now mine. Kneel before me, insignificant creatures, and you may yet serve my empire as laborers. Resist, and you shall burn. Witness the fates of those who dared oppose me." Images of Jorvax's past conquests followed, planets reduced to molten slag, fleets torn apart like paper, and the Warlord himself standing atop the ruins of an alien city, laughing as the ashes settled. The message ended abruptly, leaving the world in stunned silence. For a moment, fear reigned. Then, as humans often do, in the face of the incomprehensible, they reacted in ways that baffled their would-be overlord. Social media exploded with memes mocking Jorvax's dramatic proclamation. "Jorvax, try me," and "Earth is closed," trended within hours. Edited clips of his speech went viral, some with circus music added, others with captions like, "Somebody woke up on the wrong side of the galaxy." A particularly popular video looped Jorvax's laugh over a cat knocking a glass off a table. But the defiance wasn't just online. Across the globe, people sprang into action. Governments convened emergency sessions. Engineers, scientists, and inventors began pooling resources, cobbling together defenses and weapons from anything they could find. And though the odds were overwhelmingly against them, humanity's resolve hardened. On the Dominance Eternal, Jorvax watched these developments with mild amusement. "They are bold," he remarked. "Boldness without power is nothing but noise." He waved a hand dismissively. "Deploy the drones. Let them see how futile their resistance is." Velnakian drones, sleek and deadly, rained down upon Earth's cities, targeting power grids, transportation networks, and communication hubs. Humanity fought back fiercely. Fighter jets streaked through the skies, missiles launched from hidden silos, and anti-aircraft batteries roared across the land. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Earth might hold its ground. But the Velnakian technology was far superior. The drones adapted quickly, the shields deflecting missiles, their energy weapons cutting through defenses like butter. Cities burned, and humanity's armies were forced into retreat. Despair began to creep in. In a small Midwest town far from the front lines, Victor Hayes sat in his cluttered garage, watching the chaos unfold on a dusty television. A 32-year-old mechanic, Victor had spent his life fixing cars and tinkering with old appliances. He wasn't a soldier or a scientist. He wasn't particularly brave, or so he thought. But as he watched Jorvax broadcasts, those smug proclamations of Earth's defeat, something inside him snapped. "No way," he muttered to himself, slamming a wrench onto the workbench. "I'm not letting some overgrown tin can walk in here and call the shots." The idea was reckless, even stupid, but Victor couldn't let it go. He'd seen enough. If nobody else could stop Jorvax, then maybe, just maybe, he could. He started with an old pickup truck, stripping it down to its frame. Over the next several days, he worked tirelessly, welding, hammering, and wiring, until his garage echoed with the sounds of creation. He scavenged parts from junkyards, rigged weapons from farm equipment, and jury-rigged a power system using old car batteries and spare generator parts. The result was a monstrous contraption that looked like it had been built by a madman. It was a towering, smoke-belching machine, bristling with weapons and armor made from scrap metal. Victor called it the Scrap Sentinel. "Not much to look at," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow, "but it's gonna have to do." His plan was simple: drive straight into the nearest Velnakian staging area and cause as much chaos as possible. It was suicidal, sure, but maybe it would inspire someone else to fight harder, or at least give Jorvax a headache. At dawn, Victor rolled the Sentinel onto the highway. The machine groaned and rattled, but it moved. Strapped into the driver's seat, Victor gripped the controls and muttered, "Well, this is the dumbest thing I've ever done." As he approached the alien staging area, Victor's heart pounded. The sight of the drones hovering above the massive, sleek alien vehicles made him feel small. But he didn't stop. He fired the Sentinel's main weapon, an electromagnetic pulse cannon cobbled together from microwaves and car batteries. The weapon discharged with a deafening hum, sending a ripple through the air. Several drones short-circuited and fell from the sky, crashing into the ground with satisfying explosions. Victor whooped in triumph, but the celebration was short-lived. The Velnakian tanks turned toward him, their energy weapons locking on. Victor grinned, gripping the controls tighter. "All right, big guys, let's dance." He fired the Sentinel's makeshift rockets, sending a barrage of shrapnel and fire into the advancing tanks. The explosions lit up the battlefield, but the tanks kept coming. The Sentinel groaned under the strain as Victor maneuvered it through the chaos, narrowly avoiding energy blasts that scorched the ground around him. From the Dominance Eternal, Jorvax watched the battle unfold on a tactical display. His officers were baffled. "What is that thing?" one asked. Jorvax leaned forward, studying the crude machine as it wreaked havoc on his forces. For the first time, his expression shifted, not to fear, but to something like intrigue. "A toy," he said, his voice low. Then he laughed, the sound deep and menacing. "A desperate gambit from desperate creatures, amusing but irrelevant. Send the heavy units, let us crush this pest." Victor, now facing a fresh wave of tanks and drones, tightened his grip on the controls. The Scrap Sentinel shuddered under the barrage of firepower, sparks flying as its improvised armor began to buckle. "Come on, girl," he muttered, slamming a fist on the dashboard. "Hold it together." He steered the Sentinel toward a crumbling overpass, hoping to use the terrain to his advantage. As the alien forces closed in, Victor hit the release switch for his improvised explosive charges, setting the stage for one last, desperate stand. The Scrap Sentinel groaned as Victor drove it onto the crumbling overpass, the machine's bulk causing chunks of concrete to fall into the canyon below. The The pursuing Velnakian tanks rumbled after him, their sleek alien designs somehow graceful even in their lethality. Overhead, drones hovered, their energy weapons charging to fire. The Victor glanced at the display panel, a mishmash of salvaged screens duct-taped together. The warning lights told him what he already knew. The Sentinel wasn't going to last much longer. He clenched his jaw and flipped a series of switches. The makeshift detonators for the overpass charges were armed. As the first tank rolled onto the bridge behind him, Victor slammed the Sentinel's brakes, skidding to a halt. The pursuing tank hesitated for a moment, its targeting systems adjusting. That pause was all Victor needed. He punched the detonator switch. The charges exploded with a deafening roar, and the overpass began to collapse. Concrete and steel twisted and crumbled, dragging the lead tank into the abyss below. Victor floored the Sentinel's accelerator, the machine lurching forward just as the bridge gave way beneath its rear wheels. The Sentinel landed hard on the other side of the canyon, its shocks groaning under the impact. Victor barely had time to catch his breath before a new warning light blinked furiously on the dashboard. "Shield's failing," he muttered. "Great." He looked back to see one of the Velnakian tanks had managed to leap the collapsing gap, landing heavily on the far side, its energy weapons swiveled toward him, glowing ominously. Victor slammed the controls, firing off the last of the Sentinel's improvised smoke bombs. Thick, acrid clouds enveloped the machine, temporarily obscuring it from view. He veered the Sentinel into a cluster of boulders, hoping to use the terrain to gain some cover. The alien tank emerged from the smoke, its weapons firing into the rocks, shattering them with precise blasts. Victor maneuvered as best as he could, the Sentinel's clunky frame barely able to avoid the relentless fire. Then, to his astonishment, the tank hesitated. Its weapons fizzled out, and the machine jerked awkwardly before going still. Victor stared at it for a moment before realizing what had happened. "The EMP field," he said, slamming a fist on the armrest. His earlier electromagnetic pulse had disrupted the tank's systems, buying him a precious moment. Victor didn't waste it. He steered the Sentinel around the immobilized tank, slamming into its side with the machine's full weight. The alien vehicle tipped, groaning under the impact, and tumbled into the canyon below. Victor exhaled sharply, gripping the controls tightly. Okay, 2 tanks down, only 1 billion more to go. He didn't have time to celebrate. The sky above darkened as a sleek, black craft descended toward the battlefield. Unlike the drones or tanks, this ship bore intricate markings along its surface, and its design was sharper, more menacing. Victor squinted. That's not good. The craft landed with a hiss, steam venting from its sides. Victor instinctively reversed the Sentinel, putting some distance between himself and the new arrival. The ship's hatch opened, and a towering figure emerged. Encased in shimmering armor that pulsed with faint red light, Jorvax the Conqueror stepped onto the battlefield. He surveyed the destruction with a slow, deliberate gaze, his crimson eyes narrowing as they locked onto Victor and the scrap Sentinel. Victor's throat went dry. "You've gotta be kidding me." Jorvax spoke, his voice amplified to a thunderous boom. "Human, you have defied my forces and insulted my empire. I am here to end your insolence personally." Victor swallowed hard, his mind racing. He'd barely survived the drones and tanks. How was he supposed to take on the Warlord himself? Jorvax strode forward, each step sending tremors through the ground. "You may kneel and spare yourself, or you may die with whatever shred of dignity your kind possesses." Victor took a deep breath and tightened his grip on the Sentinel's controls. "Yeah, kneeling's not really my thing." Jorvax tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Very well." The Warlord moved with startling speed, covering the distance between them in seconds. His massive energy blade ignited, its edge glowing with a fierce red light that distorted the air around it. Victor yanked the controls, and the sentinel jerked backward, narrowly avoiding the blade as it carved into the ground, leaving a smoldering trench. "Okay," Victor muttered, sweat dripping down his face. "This is gonna suck." Jorvax lunged again, his blade slicing through the air. Victor fired the Sentinel's remaining rockets, the makeshift projectiles exploding in a fiery shower against the Warlord's armor. The blast staggered Jorvax, but only briefly. He emerged from the smoke, his armor scorched but intact, his glowing eyes burning with anger. "You think your primitive weapons can harm me?" Jorvax roared. "I am invincible." Victor gritted his teeth. "Yeah, we'll see about that." He jammed the Sentinel's controls forward, ramming the machine into Jorvax with all the force it could muster. The impact sent both combatants sprawling, the Sentinel's frame groaning in protest. Victor scrambled to bring the machine back online, but Jorvax was already recovering, his blade raised for another strike. Victor hit the eject switch and the cockpit canopy burst open. He was launched skyward, the parachute deploying just as the Sentinel detonated below him. The explosion engulfed Jorvax in a massive fireball, the shockwave sending Victor tumbling through the air. As he drifted to the ground, Victor braced himself for what came next. He landed hard, rolling to a stop amidst the rubble. Dazed and bruised, he looked up at the fiery wreckage. For a moment it was quiet. Then, from the smoke, a towering figure emerged. Jorvax. His armor was cracked and sparking, his movements slower and more labored, but he was still standing. He staggered forward, his glowing eyes fixed on Victor with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Dare," Jorvax rasped, his voice crackling like broken glass. Victor picked himself up, his legs trembling. He had no weapons, no plan, and no machine to fight with. But as Jorvax advanced, something inside him refused to back down. All right," Victor muttered to himself, his fists clenching. "Let's finish this." Victor stared up at Jorvax as the Warlord descended the ridge, his towering frame dragging slightly with each step. Sparks flickered across the cracks in the once impenetrable armor, but Jorvax was far from finished. The Warlord's crimson eyes glowed brighter than ever, fueled by a mixture of fury and disbelief. Victor's chest heaved, every muscle screaming in protest. His legs felt like they might give out at any second, but he planted his feet firmly in the rubble. The Sentinel was gone, its smoldering wreckage lying scattered behind him. He was alone now, no weapons, no backup, no tricks left to pull. Yet he stood his ground. Jorvax stopped a few paces away, looming over him like a monolith. His energy blade sputtered with uneven pulses, its once dazzling glow now flickering erratically. Still, it was more than enough to end Victor with a single strike. "You," Jorvax growled, his deep gravelly voice like an earthquake. "You are nothing, a creature of dust. Yet you dare to wound me." He staggered slightly but steadied himself, raising the blade. "Your defiance will not save you." Victor wiped sweat and grime from his brow, squaring his stance. "Yeah, you keep saying that, big guy, but here I am." Jorvax roared, his voice shaking the air, and lunged. His massive blade swung downward with enough force to split the ground, but Victor dove to the side, barely avoiding the strike. The impact sent shards of rock flying in every direction, one grazing his shoulder. He rolled to his feet, adrenaline pushing him beyond exhaustion. "Come on!" Victor shouted, goading him. "You've conquered planets, right? You can't take out one guy with a wrench and some duct tape?" Jorvax snarled, swinging his blade in a wide arc. Victor ducked low, grabbing a piece of jagged metal from the debris. He hurled it at Jorvax's exposed side. The makeshift projectile bounced off harmlessly, but the sudden impact made Jorvax hesitate, just for a moment. "That's it," Victor muttered. "You're not invincible, you just think you are." The Warlord charged again, but his movements were slower now, each step more labored than the last. Victor kept moving, weaving through the debris field and forcing Jorvax to follow. The once imposing conqueror now looked like a man dragging himself through a storm, his aura of invulnerability cracking with every moment. Victor's gaze darted around the battlefield, searching for anything that could give him an edge. His eyes landed on a long, jagged metal pole jutting from the wreckage of the overpass. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. He sprinted toward it, his legs burning with every step. Jorvax roared behind him, closing the distance with surprising speed despite his injuries. Victor reached the pole and yanked it free, the metal groaning as it came loose. "All right," Victor muttered, gripping the pole tightly. "You want me? Come and get me." Jorvax paused, his glowing eyes narrowing. "You challenge me with that?" "That." His voice was filled with contempt, but there was a flicker of something else. Uncertainty. Victor smirked through gritted teeth. "Yeah, why not?" The Warlord let out a guttural laugh, raising his blade. "Foolish to the end." Jorvax charged, his massive frame barreling toward Victor like a runaway train. Victor stood his ground, bracing the pole against the rubble. At the last possible second, he shifted his weight and angled the makeshift spear upward. Jorvax's momentum carried him straight into it. The jagged pole pierced through the cracked sections of his armor, driving deep into his chest with a sickening crunch. Jorvax froze mid-charge, his massive body shuddering. Sparks erupted from the wound, and his energy blade flickered wildly before extinguishing entirely. Victor grunted, straining to keep the pole steady. Jorvax looked down at the makeshift weapon embedded in him, then back at Victor, his crimson eyes wide with fury and disbelief. "You," Jorvax rasped, his voice faltering, "you dare you finish?" Victor leaned in closer, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Yeah, I dare." With a final surge of strength, Victor twisted the pole, sending a pulse of energy through Jorvax's failing armor. The Warlord let out a roar that echoed across the battlefield, his massive frame collapsing to one knee. Energy crackled wildly around him as the lights in his armor dimmed. Jorvax toppled forward, landing with a thunderous crash that shook the ground. For a long moment, the battlefield was silent, save for the faint hum of failing energy systems. Victor staggered back, dropping the pole and collapsing onto a pile of rubble. He stared at the motionless form of Jorvax, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Against all odds, he'd done it. The sound of distant cheering broke the silence. Victor turned to see a group of survivors emerging from the wreckage. They moved cautiously at first, as though afraid Jorvax might rise again, but when it became clear the Warlord was truly defeated, they erupted in celebration. "You did it," one of them shouted. "He's down. You actually did it." Victor let out a shaky laugh, raising a hand in a tired wave. Yeah, guess I did." The crowd surged toward him, lifting him onto their shoulders despite his protests. As they carried him toward the makeshift camp, Victor caught one last glimpse of Jorvax's lifeless form lying amidst the rubble, a once unstoppable force brought low by stubborn defiance and a piece of scrap metal. In the days that followed, word of Jorvax's defeat spread like wildfire. The Velnakian fleet, leaderless and disorganized, began retreating from Earth's orbit. Humanity, bolstered by the impossible victory, rallied together for a coordinated counteroffensive, driving the remnants of the invaders back into the void. Victor Hayes became a legend overnight. His name was whispered with awe, his actions immortalized in stories, songs, and monuments. But Victor himself wanted none of it. He returned to his garage, the wreckage of the scrap Sentinel left untouched in the corner. Life went on, quieter now, but with a lingering sense of satisfaction. Every now and then Victor would glance up at the stars and smile. Somewhere out there, the galaxy would remember the day the greatest warlord it had ever known fell, not to an army, but to a mechanic with nothing left to lose.